The next morning, Karen sat in the cramped waiting room of the Riverside County Sheriff's Department, her hands folded primly in her lap and her back ramrod straight. She'd spent the previous night researching property law, harassment statutes, and something called intentional infliction of emotional distress. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow that made her feel like she was underwater. Mrs. Whitmore, a deputy with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair, appeared at the counter. "I'm Deputy Chen. I understand you want to file a complaint?" Karen stood, smoothing her black pencil skirt. She'd chosen her outfit carefully. Professional but sympathetic, authoritative but approachable. "Yes, Deputy Chen. I need to report a deliberate act of intimidation using dangerous animals." Deputy Chen's eyebrows rose slightly, but he maintained his professional demeanor. "Why don't you come back and we'll get the details?" In the small interview room, Karen laid out her case with the precision of a prosecutor. She spoke of Henderson's pattern of defiance, his deliberate flouting of community standards, and finally, the morning's attack by his vicious dogs. She even produced her smartphone, showing the deputy a shaky video she'd managed to capture of the golden retrievers barking through the fence. "Ma'am," Deputy Chen said carefully, watching the video of the two dogs wagging their tails enthusiastically. "These appear to be, well, they look like they're playing. They were protecting their territory after I was forced to enter it," Karen insisted. "Those animals were deliberately sicked on me. And you entered Mr. Henderson's property because—" Karen's jaw tightened. "To document a violation of our community guidelines. As HOA president, I have certain responsibilities, but not the right to trespass on private property," Deputy Chen interrupted gently. "Mrs. Whitmore, from what you've described, it sounds like you entered someone's yard without permission. And their dogs did what dogs do, they barked. That's not really grounds for a complaint." The fluorescent light flickered, and in that moment, Karen saw her reflection in the one-way mirror. Hair slightly mussed, eyes bright with an intensity that bordered on manic. She looked like a woman who'd climbed a fence to photograph a garden gnome. "Officer Chen," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "you don't understand what I'm dealing with. Mike Henderson is deliberately undermining 3 years of community improvement. Property values, neighborhood standards, everything I've worked for. He's destroying it piece by piece." Deputy Chen leaned back in his chair, studying her face. "Mrs. Whitmore, when's the last time you took a vacation?" The question hit her like a physical blow. "Excuse me, a vacation? Time off? You seem stressed." Karen's hands began to shake. Stressed? She wasn't stressed. She was dedicated. She was protecting her community from chaos and decline. She was? "I'm fine," she said, but even to her own ears, her voice sounded thin and brittle. Deputy Chen sighed. "Look, Mrs. Whitmore, I'm not going to take a report on this, but I am going to give you some advice. Maybe it's time to step back from the HOA for a while. Take some time to relax." "Step back?" Karen's voice cracked. "I can't step back. If I step back, everything falls apart. The community guidelines, the property values, the standards." "Ma'am, it's a garden gnome." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Karen stared at Deputy Chen, seeing not understanding but pity in his eyes. Pity for the woman who'd climbed a fence to photograph a garden gnome. Pity for the HOA president who'd called an emergency meeting over lawn decorations. Pity for someone who'd lost sight of what actually mattered. She stood abruptly, grabbing her purse with hands that trembled slightly. "Thank you for your time, Deputy Chen." "Mrs. Whitmore, wait." But she was already walking away, her heels clicking against the linoleum with sharp, staccato beats. In the parking lot, she sat in her car for a long moment, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger, eyes too bright, smile too tight, holding on to control with fingernails that were starting to crack. Her phone buzzed. A text from Bob Martins. "Karen, we need to talk. Some residents are calling for a vote of no confidence. Can you come by tonight?" Karen stared at the message until the words blurred together. Then she deleted it and started her car. she had work to do. Karen Whitmore's perfectly manicured nails dug into the chain-link fence as she scrambled over it, her HOA clipboard clattering to the ground below. Behind her, two golden retrievers barked with the enthusiasm of warriors defending their kingdom, their paws thundering against the earth as they charged toward the fence line. "This is harassment," she shrieked, her voice cracking as she tumbled ungracefully onto the sidewalk, her pristine white blazer now decorated with dirt and a suspicious green stain. Her blonde bob, usually helmet-perfect, now resembled a bird's nest after a tornado. The dogs pressed their noses through the fence, tails wagging furiously as if they'd just won the lottery. Karen straightened her blazer with trembling hands, scanning the quiet suburban street to see if anyone had witnessed her undignified retreat. Mrs. Chen from across the street quickly ducked behind her rose bushes, but not before Karen caught the unmistakable glint of a smartphone camera. "Great," Karen muttered, brushing grass from her pencil skirt. "Just great." She'd been HOA president for 3 years, and in that time, she'd transformed Willowbrook Estates from a decent neighborhood into what she proudly called a premium community. Property values had risen 17% under her leadership, a statistic she quoted more often than the weather forecast. But Mike Henderson at 47 Maple Street had become her white whale, the one resident who refused to bend to her perfectly reasonable requests. Karen retrieved her clipboard, now sporting a muddy paw print across her meticulously organized violation notices. The papers fluttered in the breeze like surrender flags, but Karen Whitmore didn't know the meaning of surrender. She'd started this morning with a simple mission: document Henderson's latest infraction, a garden gnome that violated Section 4.2 of the Community Guidelines regarding decorative lawn ornaments. The gnome, a cheerful fellow in a red hat, had appeared overnight in Henderson's front flower bed. It was exactly the kind of tacky display that would turn their upscale neighborhood into a trailer park if left unchecked. Karen had tried reasoning with Henderson through letters, phone calls, and even a personal visit last week. Each time, he'd smiled that infuriating smile and said something about property rights and reasonable enjoyment. Property rights. The phrase made Karen's left eye twitch. She'd decided to take photographic evidence this morning, armed with her trusty clipboard and a borrowed digital camera. The plan was simple: slip into his backyard, document the violation, and present irrefutable evidence at tonight's emergency HOA meeting. What she hadn't counted on was Henderson's dogs being outside. "Excuse me, ma'am, are you okay?" Karen spun around to find a jogger in neon green shorts staring at her with obvious concern. The woman's eyes traveled from Karen's disheveled appearance to the fence behind her, where the dogs continued their victory celebration. "I'm fine," Karen snapped, clutching her clipboard to her chest like a shield. "Just conducting official HOA business." The jogger's eyebrows rose toward her hairline. "By climbing over someone's fence?" "I was inspecting a violation," Karen said, her voice rising defensively. "As is my right as HOA president." The jogger's expression shifted from concern to something uncomfortably close to amusement. "Right. Well, maybe next time try the front door?" She jogged away, leaving Karen standing alone on the sidewalk, her authority questioned and her dignity in tatters. But as she watched the jogger disappear around the corner, Karen's jaw set with renewed determination. Henderson thought he could humiliate her. He had no idea what he was dealing with. She had an emergency HOA meeting to call. The emergency HOA meeting was packed. Karen arrived 15 minutes late, having spent 45 minutes in her car working up the courage to face the crowd. Word had spread beyond Willowbrook Estates. She spotted faces she didn't recognize, phones held high to capture what everyone expected to be her final humiliation. The community center felt different now. The same metal chairs, the same fluorescent lights, but the atmosphere had shifted from suburban bureaucracy to something closer to a public execution. Whispers followed her as she walked to the front, and someone in the back actually laughed, a sound that cut through her like glass. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "I know there's been controversy regarding my recent actions as HOA president." "Controversy?" someone called out. You mean criminal trespassing? More laughter. Karen's hands trembled as she gripped the podium, but she pressed on. I want to address the vote of no confidence. And I want to explain. The room fell silent. Even the reporters in the back row leaned forward, sensing something different in her tone. 3 years ago, when I became HOA president, our property values were stagnant. We had residents who treated their lawns like junkyards, holiday decorations up year-round, and an attitude that anything goes as long as it doesn't directly hurt anyone. Karen's voice grew stronger. I changed that. I created order. I created standards. I created a community worth living in. Mike Henderson stood up from his seat in the back. Karen, you created a prison. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Karen stared at him, seeing not the enemy she'd built up in her mind, but a man who'd simply wanted to put a garden gnome in his flower bed. Maybe, she said quietly, and the admission seemed to surprise everyone, including herself. Maybe I did. She looked out at the crowd. Neighbors she'd berated about fence heights, friends she'd alienated over mailbox colors, community members she'd turned into adversaries over the smallest infractions. When had she stopped seeing them as people and started seeing them as problems to be solved? I want to tell you about my marriage, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. My husband left me 2 years ago, said I'd become someone he didn't recognize, said I cared more about other people's lives than my own. The room was dead silent now. Even the reporters had stopped typing. He was right. I threw myself into this job because it was easier than facing the fact that my life was falling apart. I thought if I could control everything around me, maybe I could control the emptiness inside me. Her voice cracked. But you can't control emptiness. You can only acknowledge it. Sarah Kim was crying now, and Bob Martinez looked like he wanted to reach out to her. But Karen held up a hand, stopping him. I'm resigning as HOA president, effective immediately. The vote of no confidence is unnecessary because I'm confirming your worst fears about me. I became exactly what I always said I was fighting against, someone who made other people's lives smaller instead of larger. She looked directly at Mike Henderson. I'm sorry about your fence. I'm sorry about your gnome. I'm sorry about everything. Henderson nodded slowly. Apology accepted, Karen. But I have a question. Yes? What are you going to do now? Karen laughed, a sound that was half sob, half relief. I have absolutely no idea. Maybe learn to garden. Maybe get a therapist. Maybe both. She gathered her papers, her precious documentation that had consumed her life, and walked toward the door. As she reached the exit, she turned back one last time. Oh, and Mike, your gnome is actually kind of cute. I might get one for my own garden. The crowd erupted in applause, and for the first time in months, Karen smiled a real smile. Outside, the night air felt different. Cleaner somehow, full of possibilities she'd forgotten existed. As she walked to her car, she could see Henderson's house in the distance, and that little ceramic gnome still grinning from his flower bed. But now it didn't look like mockery. It looked like hope. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Saw your speech online. Brave stuff. Coffee sometime? Janet from the bookstore. Karen stared at the message, then typed back. I'd like that. Fair warning though. I'm kind of a mess right now. The response came immediately. Aren't we all? How's Tuesday at 2? Karen smiled and typed back. Perfect. But as she drove home, she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't really the end. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to channel her organizational skills into something positive. Maybe the community still needed her, just not as the iron-fisted ruler she'd become. The garden gnome controversy was over, but Karen Whitmore's story was just beginning. The Willowbrook Estates Community Center buzzed with the kind of tension usually reserved for political rallies and reality TV finance. Karen had called the emergency meeting with only 4 hours' notice, citing urgent community safety concerns in her mass email blast. Now, 23 residents sat in metal folding chairs, their faces ranging from mildly curious to openly irritated. Karen stood at the front of the room, having traded her stained blazer for a navy business suit that screamed authority. She'd also managed to tame her hair back into its usual severe bob, though a small grass stain on her left sleeve betrayed the morning's adventure. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, her voice carrying that particular tone she'd perfected. Part school principal, part corporate executive, all intimidation. "We're here to address a serious escalation in non-compliance that threatens the very fabric of our community." Bob Martinez, the treasurer, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Karen, couldn't this have waited until next week's regular meeting? I had to leave work early." "No, Bob, it could not wait." Karen's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "What I witnessed this morning represents a clear and present danger to property values and community standards." She clicked her laser pointer, and a grainy photo appeared on the projector screen. Henderson's garden gnome, captured from an awkward angle that made it look more sinister than whimsical. "This," she announced dramatically, "appeared overnight in direct violation of Section 4.2 of our community guidelines. But that's not the worst part." The audience leaned forward to spite themselves. Karen had always possessed a flair for the dramatic, but this felt different. There was something wild in her eyes, something that made even her supporters shift nervously. "When I attempted to document this violation through proper channels, I was attacked by vicious animals." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Sarah Kim, the secretary, raised her hand tentatively. "Attacked? Karen, are you okay? Should we call the police?" "I'm fine. No thanks to certain residents who seem to think property rights give them license to terrorize HOA officials." Karen's voice cracked slightly on the word terrorize, and she cleared her throat. "The question before us tonight is simple. Do we allow lawlessness to prevail, or do we take decisive action to protect our community?" That's when Mike Henderson walked in. He moved with the casual confidence of someone who'd been expecting this moment, his work boots clicking against the linoleum floor as he found an empty seat in the back row. Karen's prepared speech evaporated like morning dew. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice tight with forced politeness. "How unexpected." Mike grinned, that same infuriating smile that had haunted Karen's dreams. "Well, I heard there was an emergency meeting about my gnome. Thought I should probably show up." "This meeting is about community standards and safety," Karen corrected, her knuckles white as she gripped the podium. "Your property happens to be the focal point of these concerns." "Right," Mike nodded slowly. "And would these safety concerns have anything to do with you hopping my fence this morning?" The room went dead silent. Karen felt 23 pairs of eyes boring into her, and for a moment, her carefully constructed authority wobbled like a house of cards in a windstorm. "I was conducting an official inspection," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "On my private property? Without permission." Mike's tone remained conversational, but there was steel underneath. "Karen, that's called trespassing." Bob Martinez cleared his throat. "Is that true, Karen? Did you actually climb Henderson's fence?" The question hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Karen could feel her carefully built reputation crumbling, could see the doubt creeping into the faces of her supporters. But she was Karen Whitmore, and she didn't retreat. "I was protecting this community," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "And if that means taking extraordinary measures to document violations, then so be it." The room erupted in whispers and shocked murmurs. Henderson just sat there, smiling that damn smile, like he'd already won. But Karen was far from finished. Karen's hands shook as she poured her third cup of coffee, the bitter liquid sloshing over the rim and staining her kitchen counter. Through her window, she could see Henderson's house, and that damned gnome grinning at her from his flower bed like a tiny ceramic middle finger. She'd been watching it for 2 hours, taking notes about suspicious activity and continued violations. The doorbell rang, and Karen's heart jumped. She smoothed her hair, when had she stopped styling it, and opened the door to find Bob Martinez standing on her porch with Sarah Kim and 2 other board members behind him. "Karen," Bob said, his voice gentle but firm, "we need to talk." She led them into her living room, noting how their eyes swept over the chaos she'd somehow stopped seeing. HOA documents covered every surface, violation notices sorted into color-coded piles, and a corkboard dominated one wall, covered in photos of neighborhood infractions connected by red string like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. Jesus, Karen, Sarah whispered, staring at the wall. What is all this? Documentation, Karen said, straightening a stack of papers. Evidence. If we're going to maintain community standards, we need to be thorough. Bob exchanged glances with the others. Karen, this is a lot. How long have you been working on this? Since the Henderson situation escalated, she replied, unable to keep the pride from her voice. I've documented 17 separate violations just on Maple Street alone. Look at this. She pulled out a photograph of Mrs. Peterson's mailbox. The paint is clearly fading beyond acceptable parameters. Karen. Bob's voice was sharp enough to cut through her enthusiasm. Mrs. Peterson is 86 years old. Her husband died last month. The words hit Karen like a slap. She stared at the photo in her hands, a kind old woman's slightly weathered mailbox, and for a moment, she couldn't remember why it had seemed important. We're calling for a vote of no confidence, Sarah said quietly. Karen, you're not yourself. This has gone too far. Too far. Karen's voice rose to a pitch that made them all flinch. I'm the only one who cares about this community. I'm the only one who understands what's at stake. It's a garden gnome, Karen, Bob said. It's just a garden gnome. It's not about the gnome. The words exploded from her like a dam bursting. It's about order. It's about standards. It's about the fact that if we let one person ignore the rules, then everyone will ignore them. And then what? What happens to everything we've built? She was crying now, ugly tears that she wiped away with shaking hands. The board members shifted uncomfortably, and Karen realized she was watching her carefully constructed world crumble in real time. The vote is tonight, Bob said gently. 7 o'clock. I think you should consider stepping down voluntarily. After they left, Karen sat in her empty house, surrounded by her mountains of documentation and violation notices. The silence pressed against her like a physical weight. She walked to her window and stared out at Henderson's house, at the gnome that had somehow become the symbol of her complete and total failure. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Sold the news about your HOA drama. Interested in your story for our blog. Can we chat? News. Karen frantically opened her laptop and searched for Willowbrook Estates HOA. The results made her blood run cold. There were articles, blog posts, even a video titled HOA Karen Goes Full Psycho Over Garden Gnome. The video from Mrs. Chen's phone, Karen climbing over the fence in her stained blazer, had gone viral. The comments were brutal. This is why HOAs are cancer. Someone needs to touch grass. Imagine having this much time on your hands. Classic Karen behavior. Karen scrolled through hundreds of comments, each one a knife twist in her chest. She'd become a meme, a cautionary tale, the exact kind of person she'd always promised herself she'd never be. Her doorbell rang again. This time it was a reporter from the local news station, camera crew in tow. Karen slammed the door and drew all her curtains, but she could still hear them talking to her neighbors, still see the news van parked outside. She was trapped in her own home, a prisoner of her own making, and through it all, that ceramic gnome kept grinning at her from across the street, as if it knew exactly what it had done.